He thought he accepted to marry only one black girl, unaware he had accepted 3 black sisters. The weathered mountain man squinted through prairie dust as, not one, but 3 elegant women stepped down from the rattling stagecoach at his remote gate. Townspeople whispered that the broken hermit had finally lost his mind, signing papers he couldn't read, desperate for any human company after 5 years of crushing solitude. They wagered on when madness would claim him completely. But the 3 sisters, educated, refined, fleeing something terrible back east, carried secrets that could transform his failing ranch into an empire or destroy them all. Legal documents hidden in their traveling cases threatened not just their freedom, but his growing prosperity, while dangerous men from Philadelphia closed in with federal warrants. Can a damaged recluse and 3 fugitive women build something powerful enough to survive the forces hunting them? Or will their desperate gamble cost everything they've fought to protect? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. Duke Hartwell stood in the doorway of his weathered cabin, squinting at the chaos that had become his life. Cattle wandered loose across his Kansas prairie, the fence posts rotted and useless. His ledger books lay scattered across a table thick with dust. 5 years since the prairie fire took everything that mattered. 5 years of watching his ranch crumble while the good folks of Clearwater whispered behind his back. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Duke attempted to corral 3 stubborn steers. They scattered like leaves the moment he approached. His horse snorted in frustration, sensing his rider's mounting desperation. Sweat dripped into his eyes as he cursed under his breath. This was no way for a man to live. Samuel Briggs appeared at the property line, his merchant wagon loaded with supplies. The portly man climbed down with deliberate slowness, eyeing Duke's struggles with barely concealed amusement. "Morning, Duke. Having some trouble there?" Duke wiped his face with a dirty sleeve. "Nothing I can't handle." Briggs chuckled. "Course not. That's why your cattle are halfway to Oklahoma by now." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Got a proposition for you. Business arrangement that might solve your problems." Duke's stomach clenched. He knew that tone. Briggs only used it when he smelled desperation. "Don't need any arrangements. Domestic help," Briggs continued, unfolding the document. "Someone to manage the household duties. Cook, clean, handle the books. All you provide is room and board. Protection." The word hung in the air between them. Protection from what? Duke wondered. But looking at his failing ranch, his empty cabin, the endless lonely nights, he found himself listening. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just sign here." Briggs produced a pen. "The Washington family situation back east needs resolving. Simple arrangement benefits everyone." Duke stared at the paper. The legal language blurred together, meaningless words about employment and obligations. His hands shook as he held the pen. When had he become so pathetic that merchants pitied him enough to offer charity? "One person? The arrangement covers the Washington situation. Room, board, protection. Sign here." Duke signed without reading. The ink felt like surrender. 3 days later, dust clouds announced the approaching stagecoach. Duke had spent the time attempting to make his cabin presentable. He swept the floors, cleared the table, even shaved for the first time in weeks. The mirror showed a man aged beyond his 42 years, hollow-eyed and worn thin by grief. The stagecoach rattled to a stop outside his gate. Duke walked forward, expecting to meet his new employee. The driver climbed down and opened the passenger door. 3 women stepped onto his prairie. Duke's mouth fell open. The first woman was tall and elegant, her dark skin radiant despite the long journey. She wore a traveling dress that probably cost more than Duke's horse. The second woman was shorter, with sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed everything around her with military precision. The third was youngest, clutching a worn leather book against her chest like armor. All 3 were refined, educated, beautiful. All 3 were staring at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "Mr. Hartwell?" The eldest woman stepped forward. "I'm Lila Washington. These are my sisters, Zuri and Kessie. We're here about the arrangement. Duke's brain struggled to process the situation. All three of you? The Washington family arrangement, Lila confirmed. Didn't Mr. Briggs explain? Duke felt heat rise in his cheeks. His cabin had one bedroom, one small table, one chair. He'd prepared for a hired hand, not three refined ladies who looked like they belonged in Philadelphia drawing rooms. Zuri stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. Is there a problem, Mr. Hartwell? No problem. Duke's voice cracked like a teenager's. Just wasn't expecting... the cabin's not really... Kessie whispered something to Lila, who nodded gravely. Duke caught fragments about sleeping arrangements and proper accommodations. His face burned with embarrassment. Perhaps we should discuss the terms inside, Lila suggested diplomatically. Duke led them toward his cabin, acutely aware of every creaking board and peeling paint. The interior looked even worse, with 3 pairs of critical eyes examining it. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through dirty windows. His unmade bed dominated the single room. Cozy, Zuri remarked dryly. Lila shot her sister a warning look. Mr. Hartwell, perhaps you could clarify what Mr. Briggs told you about our arrangement. Duke shifted uncomfortably. Said you needed domestic help, room and board in exchange for household duties. The 3 sisters exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Kessie clutched her book tighter. And what did he tell you about our circumstances? Lila asked carefully. Something about a family situation back east. More glances. Duke sensed undercurrents he couldn't understand. These women carried themselves like royalty, but their eyes held shadows of fear. Mr. Hartwell, Lila began, there are things you should know about why we're here. Things that might complicate this arrangement. Before she could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted. Through the window, Duke saw 2 men on horseback, their clothes marking them as strangers to these parts, city men. All 3 sisters went rigid. We can't be seen, Zuri hissed. Kessie moved toward the back of the cabin, her book pressed against her racing heart. Duke looked from the approaching riders to the terrified women in his cabin, understanding that his simple domestic arrangement had just become something far more dangerous. The riders passed without stopping, their horses kicking up clouds of prairie dust. Duke watched them disappear over the ridge before turning back to the 3 sisters huddled in his cabin. Their terror had been real, raw. Who were they? Lila smoothed her traveling dress with trembling hands. Perhaps no one. Perhaps someone sent to find us. Find you for what? Silence stretched between them like a loaded gun. Kessie clutched her book so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Zuri positioned herself near the window, watching the horizon with the alertness of a hunted animal. We should explain, Lila finally said. You deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into. Duke pulled out his single chair for her. She remained standing. We're not exactly domestic help, Mr. Hartwell. We're educated women, all 3 of us. She gestured to her sisters. Zuri studied animal husbandry at agricultural college. Kessie attended finishing school in Boston. I was a teacher and bookkeeper in Philadelphia. Duke's confusion deepened. Then why are you here? Why leave all that? Because educated women aren't always allowed to use their education, Zuri said bitterly. Not when family obligations get in the way. Our father made certain arrangements, Lila continued carefully. Arrangements we couldn't accept. So we answered your advertisement. What advertisement? The sisters exchanged those loaded glances again. Duke was getting tired of being the only person in the room who didn't understand what was happening. Mr. Briggs said you were seeking a companion, someone to help manage your ranch. We saw it as an opportunity for a new life. Duke looked around his cramped, dirty cabin. This isn't exactly the life educated ladies usually choose. You'd be surprised what we're willing to choose when the alternative is worse. Kessie spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. Over the following days, Duke learned the sisters hadn't exaggerated their abilities. Lila took one look at his scattered financial records and immediately began organizing them into neat columns. Her mathematical skills surpassed those of most bank clerks Duke had encountered. She discovered his first shock on a Tuesday morning. Duke found her hunched over his ledger books, pages of calculations spread across the table. "Mr. Hartwell, are you aware that you're quite wealthy?" Duke laughed. "Lady, look around. Does this look like wealth to you? Your cattle sales from last year alone netted $8,000. Your land holdings are worth at least $15,000. You have money sitting in 3 different banks." She held up a stack of unopened letters. "These are dividend payments you never collected." Duke stared at the papers. "That can't be right." "It's right. You're just terrible at managing money." Lila explained how his late wife had handled all financial matters. After her death, Duke had simply deposited checks and paid bills without tracking anything. Money accumulated while his ranch fell apart around him. "I attended every business meeting my father held," Lila said, her fingers dancing across the ledger pages. "Hidden behind curtains, listening through keyholes. He never knew I was learning his methods." "Why hide?" "Because women aren't supposed to understand money. We're supposed to spend it, not manage it." Zuri's talents revealed themselves when Duke's prize bull fell ill. The animal lay panting in the barn, foam dripping from its mouth. Duke prepared to put the beast out of its misery. "Wait." Zuri knelt beside the bull, examining its eyes and gums. Her touch was gentle but confident. "This isn't sickness, it's poisoning." "How do you know?" "I spent 2 years disguised as a man at Pennsylvania Agricultural College, studied veterinary science under Professor Williams." She mixed herbs from her traveling bag into a paste. "There was an outbreak of cattle poisoning in Philadelphia 3 years ago. I saved 30 head of livestock." "Disguised?" "Bound my chest, cut my hair," spoke in a deeper voice. "Learned more in those 2 years than most men learn in a lifetime." She worked through the night, administering treatments and monitoring the bull's condition. By morning, the animal was standing and eating. Duke watched in amazement as his most valuable livestock recovered completely. Kessie's transformation of his meals bordered on miraculous. She took his sparse supplies of flour, beans, and preserved meat and created dishes that wouldn't have been out of place in fancy hotels. "Finishing school taught us practical skills alongside etiquette," she explained while kneading bread dough. "Cooking, preservation, household chemistry. They wanted us to be perfect wives who could manage estates." Her skills extended beyond cooking. Within a week, she'd planted a vegetable garden using seeds from her traveling supplies. She preserved fruits and vegetables using techniques Duke had never seen. When neighbors tasted her preserves, orders began arriving daily. "I won cooking competitions in Boston," Kessie admitted shyly. "Under assumed names, of course. Ladies weren't supposed to compete professionally." Duke found himself consulting all 3 sisters on ranch decisions. Their education surpassed that of most men in Clearwater. They spoke multiple languages, understood complex mathematics, possessed knowledge about agriculture, finance, and domestic sciences that amazed him. But their fear remained constant. They jumped at unexpected sounds, scanned the horizon for approaching riders, whispered among themselves when they thought he couldn't hear. Letters began arriving from Philadelphia. The sisters' faces went pale whenever Duke mentioned the mail. They never opened the envelopes, just burned them in the fireplace. Duke built a second cabin for their privacy, working from dawn to dusk to give them proper accommodations. The sisters insisted on helping, demonstrating construction skills that rivaled those of professional carpenters. As autumn approached, Duke realized his failing ranch had transformed into the most prosperous spread in the county. The sisters' combined talents had created something extraordinary from his previous disaster. But their past was catching up with them. Duke could feel it in their increasing nervousness, their frequent glances toward the eastern horizon, their whispered conversations that stopped whenever he appeared. The weathered mountain man who had signed papers without reading was about to discover the true cost of his desperate gamble. The well-dressed stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning, his black carriage cutting through the prairie dust like a blade. Duke was mending fence when the man approached, his city clothes pristine despite the long journey from town. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Edmund Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to my employers." Duke straightened, hammer still in his hand. "Don't know what you're talking about." Blackwood smiled without warmth. He produced a leather portfolio from his coat. 3 women, the Washington sisters. I have legal documents authorizing their return to Philadelphia. Through the cabin window, Duke saw movement. The sisters had spotted the stranger. Lila pressed herself against the wall while Zuri positioned herself near the back door. Kessie had vanished entirely. Can't help you, Duke said. Mr. Hartwell, harboring fugitives is a federal crime. These women broke legal contracts, marriage contracts. Blackwood's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. They must return to fulfill their obligations. Duke felt ice form in his stomach. Marriage contracts. The sisters hadn't mentioned husbands. What kind of obligations? The kind that involve federal marshals if I don't get cooperation. Blackwood tucked the portfolio away. You have 24 hours to produce them. After that, this becomes a legal matter. The stranger departed in his black carriage, leaving Duke staring at the dust clouds. Inside the cabin, he found the 3 sisters huddled together like frightened children. Marriage contracts? Duke's voice came out harder than he intended. Lila lifted her chin with dignity that couldn't quite hide her terror. It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. Our father arranged marriages for all 3 of us, wealthy men in Philadelphia, business associates. Her hands twisted in her lap. We were to marry them within the month. So you ran away from your weddings. That what this is about? Zuri stepped forward, her eyes blazing. You don't understand. These weren't marriages. They were sales. Duke felt the ice in his stomach spread to his chest. Sales? Our father has gambling debts, substantial ones. Lila's voice remained steady despite her shaking hands. The men he chose for us weren't seeking wives. They were buying educated property. Kessie spoke from the corner where she'd been hiding. Mr. Morrison told me I'd manage his household accounts and teach his children, but I'd never be allowed to leave his estate. Ever. Mr. Fleming wanted a veterinarian who couldn't charge him fees, Zuri added bitterly. Someone who'd tend his horses and cattle without pay. Forever. Duke sank into his chair as the full horror became clear. They were buying slaves. Educated slaves with marriage certificates to make it legal, Lila confirmed. We'd have no rights, no freedom, no hope of escape. The contracts our father signed gave them complete control over our lives. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because we hoped they'd give up looking. We hoped we could disappear into the frontier and build new lives. Tears finally broke through Lila's composure. We were naive. Duke stood and began pacing the small cabin. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. What happens if you go back? We become property, Zuri said flatly. Beautiful, educated property that can manage businesses and bear children. But property nonetheless. And if you don't? Blackwood wasn't bluffing about federal marshals, Lila said. The contracts are legal under Pennsylvania law. We broke them by fleeing. Duke stopped pacing. Through the window he could see his thriving ranch, transformed by these women's intelligence and skills. The idea of them returning to slavery disguised as marriage made his blood boil. There's got to be another way. What way? Kessie's voice was barely a whisper. We're 3 women with no legal standing. They're wealthy white men with federal law on their side. Duke thought about his own past. His wife had been sold into an arranged marriage before he'd helped her escape. They'd run west to avoid her family's legal pursuit. But they'd had time to plan, money to travel, and only one person to hide. How long before Blackwood comes back? He said 24 hours, Lila replied. Then we have until tomorrow to figure this out. Zuri laughed bitterly. Figure what out? You can't fight federal law. Maybe I can't, but I know people who understand territorial law better than city lawyers. Duke grabbed his hat. I'm riding to town, going to talk to Judge Morrison. The judge won't help us, Kessie said. We're just 3 women who broke contracts. You're 3 human beings who saved my ranch and my sanity. That's got to count for something. Duke saddled his horse and rode hard toward Clearwater. Behind him, the sisters watched from the cabin windows, their faces etched with despair. They'd found freedom for a few precious months, had used their talents to build something beautiful. Now it was slipping away like water through their fingers. In town, Duke learned that Judge Morrison was away on circuit court duties. The local sheriff, Jim Bradley, listened to Duke's story with growing concern. "This is messy, Duke. If those contracts are legal back east, territorial law might not protect them here." "There's gotta be something." Sheriff Bradley scratched his graying beard. "Maybe. Territorial courts sometimes view coercion differently than federal courts. But you'd need proof these women were forced into those contracts." "What kind of proof?" "Evidence of threats, physical force, financial manipulation. Something that shows they didn't sign willingly." Duke rode home as sunset painted the prairie blood red. The sisters waited in grim silence, their few possessions already packed. They'd accepted defeat before the battle had even begun. "We should leave tonight," Lila said quietly, "before Blackwood returns. At least that way you won't be charged with harboring fugitives." Duke looked at these three remarkable women who'd transformed his life in just a few months. The idea of letting them disappear into the wilderness, alone and hunted, was unthinkable. "Nobody's leaving," he said firmly. "We're going to fight this." Dawn broke gray and cold over the prairie. Duke found Lila already awake, hunched over the kitchen table with papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but determined. "What are you doing?" "Research," she held up a thick book. "Territorial law regarding contract enforcement. I found some interesting precedents." Zuri emerged from the back room carrying a wooden box. "Letters from Philadelphia. Everything we saved." Her voice was steady now, the terror replaced by grim resolve. "Evidence of what they really wanted from us." Kessie joined them, her own collection of papers in hand. "Correspondence from our intended husbands. Their true intentions are quite clear when you read between the lines." Duke marveled at their transformation. Yesterday they'd been terrified fugitives ready to flee. Today they'd become warriors preparing for battle. Lila spread a map across the table. "Kansas territorial law is different from Pennsylvania state law. Contracts signed under duress can be voided if we can prove coercion." "What kind of coercion?" "Financial threats against our father, physical intimidation, deceptive terms." Lila pulled out a letter written in elegant script. Mr. Fleming wrote that he expected his new wife to work his ranch without compensation beyond room and board. He specifically mentioned her education would be useful for managing his breeding records. Duke read over her shoulder. The letter's cold calculation made his skin crawl. Fleming discussed Zuri like a prize mare he'd purchased. Zuri opened her wooden box and withdrew a bundle of correspondence. Morrison was even more direct. She read from a letter dated 3 months earlier. "Your daughter will find her veterinary knowledge quite useful in my stables. Of course, she'll have no time for outside employment once we're wed." They weren't seeking wives, Kessie added quietly. They were buying skilled labor with marriage licenses. Duke studied the evidence mounting on his table. "This proves they intended to use your skills without pay. But does it prove coercion?" Lila produced another document. "This is a copy of the debt agreement between our father and Mr. Fleming. Papa owed $12,000 in gambling debts. Fleming agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for Zuri's hand in marriage. Same with Morrison and me," Kessie said. $8,000 forgiven for a wife who could manage his household and teach his children. Blackwood himself handled my arrangement," Lila continued. $15,000 in debt forgiveness for a wife with bookkeeping skills." Duke whistled low. "Your father sold all 3 of you to pay gambling debts." $35,000 worth of debts, Zuri confirmed. "We weren't brides. We were payment." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Through the window, Duke saw Blackwood's black carriage accompanied by 2 mounted men wearing federal badges. His 24 hours were up. "Stay calm," Duke told the sisters. "Let me handle this." He stepped outside to meet the delegation. Blackwood emerged from his carriage with the same cold smile, now backed by federal authority. "Mr. Hartwell, I trust you've had time to consider your position." "I've considered it." "Excellent. Where are the Washington sisters?" Duke crossed his arms. "They're under my protection." One of the federal marshals, a lean man with gray whiskers, stepped forward. "Sir, we have legal authority to retrieve these women. Interfering with federal officers is a serious crime." "What crime have they committed?" Blackwood consulted his leather portfolio. "Breach of contract, theft of property, unlawful flight to avoid legal obligations." "Property?" "The education their father paid for, the wedding preparations, the business arrangements disrupted by their departure." Blackwood's smile widened. They cost their intended husbands significant money. Duke felt rage building in his chest. People aren't property. "Contractual obligations are binding regardless of personal feelings," the marshal replied. "These women signed legal documents." Did they? Or did their father sign for them? Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Their father had legal authority to arrange marriages for his unmarried daughters. In Pennsylvania, this is Kansas territory." The cabin door opened behind Duke. The three sisters emerged, their evidence carefully organized in Lila's arms. They'd dressed in their finest clothes, transforming themselves into the educated ladies they truly were. Lila stepped forward with regal dignity. "Gentlemen, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of these contracts." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "There's no misunderstanding. You're coming back to Philadelphia." "I don't think we are." Lila opened her folder and began distributing copies of letters and documents. "These are communications from our intended husbands detailing their expectations for unpaid labor." The gray-whiskered marshal examined the papers with growing confusion. "These sound more like employment contracts than marriage arrangements." "Exactly," Zuri joined her sister. "We weren't being offered marriages. We were being sold as educated servants." Kessie produced the debt agreements. "Our father used us as collateral for gambling debts. $35,000 in total." The second marshal, younger with intelligent eyes, studied the documents carefully. "Mr. Blackwood, these contracts appear to involve financial coercion." "Standard business arrangements," Blackwood replied hastily. "Debt consolidation through marriage is perfectly legal." "Not in Kansas territory," Lila said firmly. "Territorial law requires that marriage contracts be entered into freely by both parties. Coercion voids the agreements." Duke watched the federal marshals exchange glances. They'd arrived expecting to collect runaway brides, not prosecute a case involving debt slavery disguised as marriage. The gray-whiskered marshal folded the letters carefully. "This situation requires legal review. We can't simply collect these women based on contracts that might be invalid under territorial law." Blackwood's composure cracked. "Those contracts are binding under federal law." "Marriage law is typically handled by territorial courts," the younger marshal replied, "especially when coercion is alleged." Duke seized the opening. "I'm formally requesting a territorial hearing to determine the validity of these contracts." "You have no legal standing," Blackwood protested. "I do." Lila stepped closer to Duke. "Mr. Hartwell is our legal representative. We've retained him to defend our interests." Duke blinked in surprise, but kept his expression steady. The sisters had just made him their lawyer without asking. He hoped territorial law was more forgiving of unqualified representation than federal court. The marshals conferred quietly before the older one addressed Blackwood. "We'll escort you back to town. A territorial judge will need to review these contracts before any enforcement action." Blackwood's face darkened with fury. "This is a delay tactic. These women belong to their husbands. If the contracts are valid, the court will enforce them," the marshal replied diplomatically. "If they're not, the women are free to make their own choices." As the federal delegation departed, Duke turned to face three sisters who'd just gambled everything on territorial law and an untrained representative. Their future now depended on convincing a judge that love couldn't be bought with debt forgiveness. The territorial courthouse in Clearwater had never seen a crowd like this. Word of the Washington sisters case had spread across 3 counties. Ranchers, shopkeepers, and farmers filled every seat, spilling onto the courthouse steps. Some came to support the sisters. Others arrived hoping to witness federal law crush territorial defiance. Judge Harrison Miles entered the packed courtroom with the measured steps of a man who understood history was being made. His weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Duke sat at the defendant's table with the three sisters, their evidence organized in neat stacks. Across the aisle, Blackwood consulted with a Philadelphia lawyer who'd arrived on the morning train. The man's expensive suit and calculating eyes marked him as someone accustomed to winning complicated cases. This court will determine the validity of marriage contracts signed in Pennsylvania and their enforcement under Kansas territorial law, Judge Miles announced. Mr. Blackwood, present your case. Blackwood rose with practiced confidence. He produced the original contracts, each bearing official seals and notarized signatures. Your Honor, these are legally binding marriage agreements. The Washington sisters violated these contracts by fleeing their obligations. The Philadelphia lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Patterson, took over. Mr. Washington held full legal authority to arrange marriages for his unmarried daughters. The contracts specify terms, conditions, and mutual obligations. The defendant's flight constitutes breach of contract and theft of services. Theft of services? Educational expenses, wedding preparations, business disruptions caused by their unlawful departure. Total damages exceed $40,000. Judge Miles examined the contracts carefully. These documents appear legally sound under Pennsylvania law. Mr. Hartwell, how do you respond? Duke stood on unsteady legs. His hands trembled as he faced the packed courtroom. He'd never argued a legal case in his life. The sisters' freedom depended on his untrained words against Philadelphia's finest legal minds. Your Honor, these weren't marriage contracts. They were sale agreements. Patterson objected immediately. Inflammatory characterization without basis. I'll allow it, Judge Miles said. Continue, Mr. Hartwell. Duke's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm. Lila Washington, please present your evidence. Lila rose with calm dignity. She'd transformed herself for court, her bearing radiating the education and intelligence that made her so valuable to her intended purchasers. Your Honor, I submit correspondence from Mr. Blackwood detailing his expectations for our marriage. She read from the letters with clear, precise diction. Quote, your bookkeeping skills will prove invaluable in managing my business interests. Your education ensures you can handle complex financial matters without outside assistance. End quote. The courtroom stirred as the implications became clear. Blackwood had been seeking an unpaid accountant, not a wife. Mr. Blackwood also wrote about compensation. Quote, beyond room and board, you'll require no additional payment for your services. A wife's duties encompass all aspects of household management. End quote. Judge Miles leaned forward. He expected you to work without wages? Indefinitely, Your Honor. Marriage would legally bind me to provide professional services without compensation. Zuri stood next, her confident bearing commanding attention. My intended husband, Mr. Morrison, was equally direct about his expectations. She produced Morrison's letters, reading the most damaging passages. Quote, your veterinary training solves my staffing problems perfectly. Hiring qualified animal doctors is expensive. A wife with such skills eliminates that expense entirely. End quote. The judge's expression darkened. He wanted free veterinary services. For life, Your Honor. Another letter discusses expanding his livestock operations based on having unlimited access to veterinary care. Kessie's testimony proved equally damaging. Her intended husband had calculated the financial value of her domestic skills, estimating thousands in annual savings from her cooking, teaching, and household management abilities. Duke watched the judge's face as the evidence mounted. Each letter revealed the cold calculation behind the marriages. These men had purchased skilled professionals disguised as brides. Your Honor, Duke said, finding his confidence, these contracts don't describe marriages. They describe indentured servitude. Patterson rose angrily. Objection. Marriage naturally involves domestic duties. Domestic duties, yes, Judge Miles replied. Professional services without compensation? That's different. Duke pressed his advantage. The debt arrangements prove these were sales transactions. Mr. Washington used his daughters as payment for gambling debts totaling $35,000. He produced the debt forgiveness agreements, each explicitly linking marriage to financial obligation cancellation. The women weren't choosing husbands. They were being traded as assets. The courtroom buzzed with shocked whispers. Several ranchers in the gallery nodded approvingly. They recognized the difference between marriage and slavery. Patterson fought back desperately. Debt consolidation through marriage is legal practice. When both parties consent freely, Duke countered, these women were given no choice: marry or watch their father face financial ruin. Judge Miles called for closing arguments. Patterson delivered a polished summation about contract law and federal authority. His arguments were technically sound, but emotionally cold. Duke rose for his final statement, his nervousness replaced by righteous anger. Your Honor, Kansas Territory was built by people seeking freedom from old constraints. We came west to escape systems that treated human beings as property. He gestured toward the sisters. These are educated, capable women who could contribute immensely to our growing territory, but only if they're free to choose their own paths. The packed courtroom fell silent as Judge Miles considered his decision. Minutes stretched like hours. Duke watched the sisters' faces, seeing hope and terror warring in their expressions. Finally, Judge Miles spoke. The court finds that marriage contracts signed under financial duress, involving the exchange of human beings for debt forgiveness, violate the fundamental principles of territorial law. The courtroom erupted in cheers and protests. Judge Miles banged his gavel repeatedly. The contracts are ruled invalid under Kansas territorial law. The Washington sisters are free to make their own choices regarding marriage and employment. Blackwood shot to his feet. This decision violates federal commerce law. Mr. Blackwood, people are not commerce. This court will not enforce slavery disguised as marriage. Duke felt his knees go weak with relief. Beside him, the three sisters embraced tearfully. They'd won their freedom through courage, evidence, and territorial justice. But Duke noticed Blackwood's expression as the crowd celebrated. The man's cold smile suggested this victory might not be permanent. Their battle for freedom had been won in court. The war for their future was just beginning. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Duke stood on his front porch, watching the morning sun illuminate the most prosperous ranch in 3 counties. The wooden sign by his gate read, Hartwell and Washington Family Ranch, in bold letters that caught the light like a promise fulfilled. The transformation still amazed him. Where once scattered cattle had wandered through broken fences, organized herds now grazed in carefully managed pastures. Zuri's veterinary expertise had eliminated disease and improved breeding stock until neighboring ranchers traveled 50 miles seeking her advice. Lila's financial management had turned Duke's hidden wealth into visible prosperity. The ranch house she'd designed stood 3 stories tall, with separate quarters for each family member and a business office that handled accounts for half the territory. Her bookkeeping services were so sought after that she'd trained 2 assistants to help manage the workload. Kessie's catering business had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Her kitchen produced wedding cakes, holiday feasts, and preserved goods that were shipped as far as Denver. The railroad depot in Clearwater kept a permanent cooling shed just for her products. Duke marveled at how wrong everyone had been about these remarkable women. The townspeople who'd once whispered about his declining sanity now sought the sisters' advice on everything from livestock breeding to business investments. What had started as a desperate arrangement had evolved into the most successful partnership in Kansas Territory. The morning mail brought letters from Philadelphia, but these carried good news instead of threats. Duke read over Lila's shoulder as she opened the correspondence. Our father lost everything, she said without emotion. The house, the business, even his personal belongings. Gambling debts finally caught up with him. Zuri looked up from treating a mare's injured leg. What about our intended husbands? Morrison was arrested for fraud in his other business dealings. Fleming's ranch failed when he couldn't find skilled workers willing to work for free. Lila folded the letter carefully. Blackwood disappeared after several of his contracts were investigated by federal authorities. Duke felt a grim satisfaction. The men who'd tried to buy human beings as property had faced the consequences of their greed. Justice had a way of balancing itself when given time. The sisters had chosen to stay not from obligation, but from genuine affection for their new life. They'd transformed Duke's failing ranch into something extraordinary while finding the freedom to use their talents fully. More importantly, they'd become the family Duke had lost in the prairie fire years earlier. Their success hadn't come without challenges. Some neighboring ranchers still grumbled about women managing business affairs. A few townspeople maintained that the court decision had been wrong. But prosperity was hard to argue with, and the sisters' contributions to the community were undeniable. Kessie had established the territory's first cooking school, teaching frontier women advanced preservation techniques and elegant meal preparation. Her students included ranchers' wives, hotel cooks, and ambitious young women seeking skills that could support them independently. Zuri's veterinary practice had saved thousands of dollars in livestock losses across the region. She'd identified and prevented 3 separate disease outbreaks, earning the grudging respect of men who'd initially refused to trust a woman with their animals. Her expertise had become so valued that territorial officials consulted her on agricultural policy. Lila's financial acumen had helped establish the Clearwater Cattlemen's Association, organizing collective bargaining with railroad companies and meat packers. Her mathematical skills and understanding of market forces had increased profits for every rancher willing to work with her. Duke had evolved from broken hermit into respected community leader. The sisters' success reflected on his judgment, and people sought his opinion on matters ranging from territorial politics to business investments. He'd found purpose again through their shared achievements. The ranch employed 12 workers now, including the 2 young women Lila had trained as bookkeepers and a veterinary assistant. Zuri was teaching animal medicine. Duke took pride in providing opportunities for others to learn valuable skills from the sisters. Their home had become a gathering place for progressive thinkers throughout the territory. Visitors included female teachers seeking advanced training, businesswomen needing financial advice, and young couples wanting wedding ceremonies that honored both partners equally. The sisters had created a model of what educated women could accomplish when given freedom to pursue their talents. Duke often reflected on the desperate man who'd signed papers without reading them, seeking only companionship to ease his loneliness. That broken hermit had accidentally created the foundation for something magnificent. The arrangement he'd thought would provide one helper had brought him 3 brilliant partners who'd transformed his entire existence. As autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Duke sat in his expanded dining room sharing Sunday dinner with his chosen family. Lila discussed expansion plans for their financial services business. Zuri outlined improvements needed for the veterinary clinic they were building in town. Kessie described her latest catering contracts and cooking school enrollment. Their conversation flowed with the easy warmth of people who'd found their place in the world. They'd built something lasting from desperation and courage, creating prosperity from the ashes of broken dreams. Duke raised his glass in a toast that had become their weekly tradition. To the arrangement that changed everything. To the family we chose, Lila responded. To the freedom we earned, Zuri added. To the home we built together, Kessie concluded. Outside, their ranch stretched across rolling hills where cattle grazed in organized contentment. The wooden sign by the gate stood as testament to their shared success. Duke Hartwell had thought he was accepting to marry only one black girl. Unaware he had accepted 3 black sisters who would transform his failing ranch into the most prosperous enterprise in Kansas territory. Their story had become legend throughout the frontier, proof that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle when people stood together against injustice.